I never expected $50 to be the reason my boss lost everything. But here we are. At first, it seemed like just another frustrating moment. An employer refusing to pay what I was rightfully owed. He acted like it was nothing, like he had won some petty power struggle. But that $50 was not just about money. It was about respect. What he did not realize was that his greed and arrogance would set off a chain of events that would bring his entire world crashing down. I was never the type to make a big deal out of things. I did my job, kept my head down, and tried to avoid unnecessary drama. But looking back, I wish I had stood up for myself sooner. Maybe then, I would not have let my boss take advantage of me for as long as he did. I worked at a small company that handled local marketing and event planning. It was nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills, well, most of the time. My boss, Greg, was the kind of person who loved power. He enjoyed making people feel small, whether it was through his condescending remarks or the way he played games with our paychecks. He would forget to pay overtime, make up excuses about why bonuses were delayed, and always act like it was our fault when there was a problem with payroll. I had been working there for nearly a year, dealing with the nonsense because I needed the job. Rent was not going to pay itself, and I had bills stacking up. But things started getting worse when the company began struggling financially. Greg became even more careless about paying us on time. And every time someone confronted him, he had a way of twisting the situation until they felt guilty for even asking. One Friday, after wrapping up a major event that I had practically run on my own, I went to Greg's office to collect my pay. We were all supposed to receive a small bonus for the extra hours we had put in, and mine was supposed to be $50. It was not a lot, but to me it mattered. I had been counting on it to help cover my utility bill, and after all the work I had done, I deserved it. I knocked on his office door, already feeling the usual anxiety that came with dealing with him. "Yeah," he called out, not bothering to look up from his computer. "Hey Greg, I just wanted to check on the extra $50 for the event." "It is not on my paycheck," I said, keeping my voice polite but firm. He sighed, still not looking at me. "Oh, that. Yeah, we went a little over budget, so I had to cut some of the bonuses." I felt my stomach drop. But we were promised that bonus. I stayed late every night this week to make sure everything ran smoothly. Greg finally looked up, a smirk playing on his lips. "And you got paid for your hours, did you not?" I clenched my jaw. "Yes, but then I do not see the issue. Look, it is just $50. You will live." He leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying this. That was the moment something snapped in me. It was not just about the money. It was about the way he dismissed me. The way he acted like my work was meaningless, like I was some replaceable cog in his machine. I had spent the past year letting him get away with this kind of treatment, always convincing myself that it was not worth the fight. But now I had enough. I took a deep breath and said, "If it is just $50, then you should have no problem paying me." His smirk faltered for a split second before he leaned forward, his expression hardening. "You are really going to make a big deal out of this?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "Because I earned that money." Greg laughed, shaking his head. "You know what? Fine. If you want to throw a tantrum over $50, go ahead. But do not expect to last much longer here with that attitude." His words were a threat, a reminder that he held all the power. Or at least, that was what he thought. I met his gaze and for the first time, I was not afraid of him. "We will see about that," I said before turning on my heel and walking out of his office. That was the beginning of the end for him. I left Greg's office shaking, not with fear, but with adrenaline. I had never stood up to him like that before, and honestly it felt good. But I also knew that I had just put a target on my back. Greg was not the type to let things go. He was petty, vindictive, and loved proving that he was the one in control. As I walked back to my desk, I started thinking about all the times he had shorted people on pay, all the broken promises, and the way he manipulated employees into thinking they had no choice but to put up with his behavior. I was done playing along. That night, I went home and started digging. I had saved emails, texts, and pay stubs from the past year. I went through everything looking for patterns. It was not just me. Greg had been underpaying people for months. Employees had complained, but nothing had ever been done. He always found a way to brush it off, blaming accounting errors or miscommunications. I reached out to a few coworkers, casually bringing up the issue of missing pay. Most of them just sighed and said it was normal. "That is just Greg," they said. "What can we do?" That was exactly what he wanted, people to feel helpless. But I was not helpless. The next morning, I sent an email to HR, laying out everything I had found. I attached screenshots, pay stubs, and messages. I detailed how Greg had repeatedly withheld wages, manipulated employees, and retaliated against those who spoke up. I kept it professional, but I made sure it was clear. This was not just a minor issue. It was a pattern of abuse. HR responded with a generic, "We will look into this," which, based on past experiences, meant we will probably do nothing. I was not surprised, but I was not deterred either. That same day, I filed a formal complaint with the labor board. I provided all my evidence and explained the situation in detail. Greg might have thought he could get away with stealing from his employees, but I was about to make sure that he paid for every cent he had taken. A few days later, I started noticing a shift at work. Greg was avoiding me, which was unusual. Normally, he loved making little digs at people, but now, he barely even looked in my direction. My coworkers also seemed on edge, whispering in hushed voices. Something was happening. Then I found out why. One of my coworkers pulled me aside in the break room. "Did you hear?" she asked, her voice low. "Hear what?" I asked. "HR is auditing payroll. Apparently, someone filed a complaint with the labor board." She raised an eyebrow, giving me a knowing look. I kept my expression neutral. "Interesting." She smirked. "Whatever happens, I just want to say thank you. Someone needed to do something." That was when I realized that I was not alone in this. My coworkers had been just as frustrated and exhausted as I was. They had just been waiting for someone to take the first step. Greg must have realized it too, because the next day, he called me into his office. I walked in keeping my head high. He looked less confident than usual, like he was trying to hold on to control, but knew it was slipping. "Close the door," he said. I did not. He sighed. "Look, I think we got off on the wrong foot the other day. I have been under a lot of pressure, and maybe I was a little short with you. I want to make things right." I crossed my arms. "Oh." Greg reached into his drawer and pulled out an envelope. He slid it across the desk. "Here, your $50. Let us put this behind us." I stared at the envelope, then back at him. He thought this was over. He thought I would take the money and walk away. I smiled. "Greg, this was never about $50. His face paled. I turned and walked out, leaving the envelope sitting on his desk. The real fallout was just beginning. The tension in the office was thick enough to cut with a knife. I could feel it every time I walked past Greg's office. Every time a hushed conversation stopped the moment I entered the room. Something was coming and Greg knew it. A week after my meeting with HR, an official notice went out. A full-scale payroll audit was underway. HR representatives started calling employees in one by one, reviewing their pay records, asking questions about discrepancies. My coworkers were nervous, but for the first time, they were also hopeful. Greg, on the other hand, was unraveling. At first, he tried to act like nothing was wrong, but as the days passed, his usual smugness faded. He snapped at employees over minor mistakes, disappeared into his office for hours at a time, and even missed a meeting with a major client. This was a man who thrived on control, and now he was losing it. Then came the breaking point. It was a Wednesday afternoon when two men in suits walked into the office. They were not clients. They were from the labor board. The office went silent as they made their way to HR, briefcases in hand. Greg's office door was closed, but I imagined he was watching through the blinds, sweating bullets. Half an hour later, Greg was called in. I did not see him leave, but when he came back out, his face was red, his jaw clenched so tight, I thought his teeth might crack. He stormed back to his office, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. Whispers spread like wildfire. People were messaging in private Slack channels, exchanging theories about what was happening. No one had ever seen Greg that shaken before. By the end of the day, a new email went out from corporate. Due to an ongoing investigation regarding payroll discrepancies, All employees affected will be contacted to ensure proper compensation. Additionally, a leadership restructuring is in progress. Further updates will be provided soon. Leadership restructuring. That was corporate's way of saying, Greg is screwed. I was packing up to leave when I heard my name. Can I talk to you? I turned to see Greg standing behind me. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by something I had never seen before, desperation. I debated telling him to shove it, but curiosity got the best of me. Sure, I said. He led me outside, away from the curious eyes of our coworkers. I know you were behind this, he said, his voice low. I met his gaze, unflinching. Behind what? His nostrils flared. Do not play dumb. The audit, the investigation. You think you have one? I tilted my head. Have I not? Greg let out a humorless laugh. You have no idea what you have done. This job, this company, it is my life. You have ruined me over $50. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. No, Greg. You ruined yourself. I just gave people the push they needed to fight back. His face twisted with rage, but he had nothing left to say. He turned and walked away, shoulders hunched, defeated. The next morning, Greg was gone. Corporate sent out a formal announcement. Greg had been terminated, effective immediately. Employees would receive back pay for any missing wages, and new policies were being put in place to prevent further misconduct. People were ecstatic. It was like a weight had been lifted off the office. For the first time in a long time, employees were laughing, talking openly, no longer walking on eggshells. And me? I sat at my desk, sipping my coffee, enjoying the sweet, sweet taste of karma. The atmosphere in the office changed overnight. With Greg gone, it was as if a storm had finally passed, leaving behind clear skies. People who used to keep their heads down were speaking up, sharing their own stories about the ways he had mistreated them. It was shocking to realize just how deep his corruption ran. Some had been denied raises they were promised. Others had their overtime conveniently forgotten, on multiple occasions. One coworker, a single mother, had been forced to work extra hours without pay, too afraid to say anything because she needed the job. Hearing all this made me even more certain that I had done the right thing. It was never about the $50. It was about justice. The biggest surprise came a week later when corporate announced that Greg was not just fired. He was under investigation for fraud. Turns out, he had been skimming company funds for years, pocketing money that was meant for employee bonuses and project expenses. The labor board's investigation had uncovered deeper financial misconduct, and corporate had no choice but to act. Greg had not just lost his job. He had lost everything. News spread that he was facing potential legal action. Rumors swirled that he was struggling to find another position, his reputation in the industry completely destroyed. No one wanted to hire a boss who had stolen from his own employees. I would be lying if I said I did not feel a little satisfaction. One afternoon, I received an email from corporate requesting a meeting. My stomach twisted slightly as I clicked on it, but as I read the contents, my nerves turned into something else, excitement. They wanted to promote me. Apparently, the higher-ups had been impressed with my work, especially after hearing from multiple employees about how I had been the one to expose Greg's corruption. They wanted me to step into a managerial role, helping to rebuild the workplace culture and ensure fairness moving forward. I stared at the email in disbelief. Less than a month ago, I had been fighting for $50. Now, I was being offered a leadership position. That night, I sat down and thought long and hard about my decision. A part of me hesitated. Did I really want to stay in a company that had allowed Greg's behavior to continue unchecked for so long? But then I remembered my coworkers, the people who had suffered under him for years. They deserved a workplace where they felt safe, where they were paid what they were owed, where they were respected. If I left, things might go back to the way they were. If I stayed, I could help change things for the better. The next morning I sent my response. I accept the position. Taking the promotion was a decision that weighed on me more than I expected. At first, I thought about the practical benefits, the higher salary, the increased authority, the ability to actually make a difference in a workplace that had suffered for so long. But then came the self-doubt. Would my coworkers respect me in this role? Would they see me as a leader? Or would they think I had just taken advantage of Greg's downfall to climb the corporate ladder? I had spent so long as just another employee, fighting against an unfair system. Now, I was about to become part of management. The first few weeks were tough. Even though I had good relationships with most of my coworkers, there was tension in the air. Some were hesitant to trust me in this new role. Others seemed relieved, as if they had been waiting for anyone other than Greg to take charge. I knew I had to prove myself. The first thing I did was review the company policies. Specifically, anything related to pay, overtime, and employee rights. It did not take long to find major gaps that Greg had clearly exploited for years. I worked with HR to draft new policies that ensured fair pay practices, proper documentation of hours, and protections for employees who reported concerns. I also made it clear to everyone, my door was always open. I wanted people to feel like they could talk to me without fear of retaliation. If someone had a problem, I wanted them to come to me directly so we could fix it together. Slowly, things started to change. Employees who had once been afraid to speak up were voicing their concerns. People were finally getting the raises and overtime pay they had been owed for months, even years. Morale improved, and the workplace actually became a place people wanted to be. And yet, despite the improvements, there was always that lingering question in my mind. What happened to Greg? For a while, he disappeared completely. No one saw him, no one heard from him. It was like he had vanished. Some speculated that he had left the city entirely, running from the consequences of his actions. But then, one evening, I got my answer. I was leaving the office late, exhausted after a long day of meetings, when I stopped by a small cafe near my apartment. I just wanted to grab a coffee before heading home. And that was when I saw him. Greg was sitting alone at a corner table, hunched over a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold. He looked different. The arrogance, the smugness, it was gone. His suit, once so polished and expensive-looking, was wrinkled and unkempt. Dark circles lined his eyes, and there was a look of defeat on his face that I had never seen before. For a moment, I just stood there, debating whether or not to approach him. Then, as if sensing my presence, Greg lifted his head and locked eyes with me. The recognition was instant. His expression shifted from exhaustion to something unreadable. Embarrassment? Bitterness? I took a deep breath and walked over to his table. Greg. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. Of all people, he muttered. I raised an eyebrow. Did not expect to run into me? He gave a dry chuckle. Did not expect to be sitting in a cheap cafe, out of work either. But here we are. There was a heavy pause. I was not sure what I expected from this moment. Maybe some last-ditch attempt at blaming me for what had happened. Maybe an arrogant remark about how he would bounce back. But instead, Greg just sighed and ran a hand through his hair. You probably think I deserved all of it, he said, not meeting my eyes. I thought about it for a second before answering. I think you did it to yourself. Greg let out another humorless laugh. Yeah, I figured you would say that. He stared down at his coffee, swirling it absently. I lost everything, you know. The job, my reputation, my savings. Corporate made sure I would never work in this industry again. I did not feel sorry for him. Not really. But for the first time, I did see him as something other than the untouchable, arrogant boss I had once feared. I saw him as a man who had destroyed himself. After a long silence, Greg finally looked at me. So, are you happy now? That question took me by surprise. Was I happy? I had gotten justice. I had seen a toxic boss taken down. I had helped improve my workplace for my coworkers. And I had even landed a promotion out of it. But happiness? That was not the right word. I am satisfied, I said finally. Not because you lost, but because people finally got what they deserved. Greg nodded slowly, as if processing my words. Then, without another word, he stood up, left a few crumpled bills on the table, and walked out into the night. I watched him go, wondering what would become of him. Would he find another job? Would he change? Would he learn from this? I did not know. And honestly, I did not care. Because for the first time in a long time, I was finally looking forward to a workplace that was fair, to a team that was empowered, to a future where no one else would have to fight for what was rightfully theirs. Greg had thought he won when he refused to pay me $50. But in the end, he had lost everything. And I had gained so much more.